Good evening. In tonight's show, our special guest is Evan Felczak, the founder of the United Independent Party. And also, we're going to be talking about politics. We're going to be talking about the Boston Olympics. We'll see what happens. Stay tuned. Could be a food fight in the studio. Good evening. Welcome to another episode of The Other Side. Tonight we have with us as our guest Evan Felczak, the founder of the United Independent Party, and Mr. James Whalen, who's also on the Planning Commission. Mr. Felczak, I'll give you a brief bio. Is a successful entrepreneur, having served for 14 years on the executive leadership team of Boston-based global healthcare company Best Doctors Incorporated. Felczak played a lead role in helping grow the company from 9 employees to over 600. The company was named to Inc. magazine's list of fastest-growing private companies in America in 2011, 2012, and 2013. He is the founder of the new United Independent Party in Massachusetts. As a candidate in the November 2014 Massachusetts gubernatorial election, Felczak surpassed the 3% threshold required by state law for the United Independent Party to earn official party status in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Mr. Felczak, congratulations. I think that was, we were talking about this a little bit before, I think that was fantastic.
Thank you.
It's a great start.
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be here with you guys.
Well, thanks for coming in tonight. We appreciate you and James coming in. Let's dive right into it. Where do you see this, where do you see the Independent Party going?
Well, the reason that we founded the United Independent Party is because so many voters feel as if the system today just isn't representing them anymore, that it's become wrapped up in left-right debates, doing the bidding of a lot of moneyed groups, and we need to change it. It's not going to change from the inside. It will only change by creating something new to challenge the political establishment and to replace it. So the founding tenets of the party is that everybody's equal and everybody's civil rights have to be protected, and we need the government to spend taxpayer money wisely. We need candidates who want to be genuine and authentic and talk about whatever the issue might be all the time across Massachusetts and in fact around the country, but not in our political sphere. So that's why we founded the United Independent Party, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Now, how do you see this as being different than, say, the Democratic Party? Because I read your platforms, and the platforms are fairly, I'd say, fairly similar in a lot of ways, and there's obviously some key differences, especially in the healthcare and education and whatnot, because the Democrats like to talk about it, but they don't want to actually put anything in effective action. What separates you from, like, which is obviously your closest associates would be the Democrats? What's going to separate you folks?
Well, I mean, I think it's a fair question to ask. I also think there's a question of what separates us from, what separates the people in the political establishment from each other. Because with Democrats and Republicans, we hear the same thing over and over again. We aren't dealing with the issues of the rising cost of living in Massachusetts. We aren't dealing with the fact that we really, and I'm glad that James is here, someone who does planning, we don't really have any statewide mechanism for planning. And it means that things like sprawl and high housing costs characterize our landscape, makes it hard for businesses to grow. We know that our state does not properly fund education or schools. This has been under Democratic leaders and now under a Republican governor, the same process playing out. We know we have $1.5 billion budget deficit. It's going to largely come off the backs of medium and low-income taxpayers to pay for this. So these problems are what the political establishment has created by kicking the can down the road on issue after issue after issue. The solutions that both the Democrats and Republicans offer just aren't that much different from each other in so many different areas. I know we'll talk, I'm sure, about the Olympics, which is sort of the new hobby horse of people in the political establishment. We do not hear Republicans or Democrats saying bad things about it. What we hear is, this is great, this is what our future should be about. And so what we offer with the United Independent Party is a different vision of the future. It's one in which we say, let us have a future in which we take on these difficult challenges and actually deal with them, as opposed to let's trim around the edges and do small bits of change that are good to satisfy perhaps party bases. Maybe they make for a good soundbite, maybe they make for a good TV commercial, but don't really deal with the stuff, the issues that people are facing each day. That's what we're offering. And you know something? It's not easy. It's not easy. You know, it's very easy for people in politics to tell you, hey, I got an easy solution for you. We're going to cut this tax or that. We're going to cut this spending or that.
But it's the same minutia over and over and over and over again. And I think that's one of the things that drives both Bob and I nuts is that you hear the same minutia. And we've talked about this a couple times. You know, you came out with this. We wanted to create just the common sense party.
I remember that.
Yeah.
The common sense party. Doesn't that's what it is. It's
We've
common
talked
sense.
about that many times.
How many times?
Yeah.
The common sense party.
This is fundamentally what the United Independent Party is about. Part of the reason it has to be a party, and this is really important for voters and for your viewers to understand, is that the way that our state law works, if you're a political party, you have easier access to the ballot. You are allowed to fundraise at a rate that is significantly higher. As a candidate for governor, the law said I was only allowed to raise $1,500 per person for my campaign. The Democrats and Republicans were allowed to raise $15,000 for their campaign per person. So a 10-to-1 difference. So when we look and we see that the majority of voters in Massachusetts are not in either of the two traditional parties, and yet none of our elected officials are outside of those parties, it tells you there's something wrong, and we have to organize in order to change it. So pointing out the things that are wrong is fairly easy, and almost anybody can do it. The question is, what do we do? And what I challenge people to say all the time is you got to enroll with a party, and it should be the United Independent Party, because otherwise we're giving tacit approval to what it is that our elected officials are doing. And they get away with it because voters either don't vote, they say, hey, they're all the same, but we need the framework in place for new people.
We've talked about that. It's funny that he brings that kind of stuff up because really the voting process has become more of, I don't know who it is. I know that guy's name, but I think I'll just vote for him.
It's the least offensive.
Least offensive, or I'm not sure if it's we had talked about some other things as far as more of a, yeah, he seems like a good guy. I know him from town. I think we'll take him.
I can tell you something else about elections, and this is from my own personal experience, having been a campaign manager recently for a gentleman down in Connecticut. When you are looking at the metrics of a campaign, and you're looking at, okay, how many voters do I need in order to surpass the threshold to go first past the post to get into office? You look at saying, okay, there's X number of Republicans, X number of Democrats. My guy is either Republican or Democrat. His chance of his base coming out and just voting the party line is far greater than somebody just making a decision. So who do I go after? People who label themselves as independent voters. You go after them like crazy. And people wonder, like, I've heard people saying, I keep getting phone calls, I keep getting all these letters. Are you registered independent just as an independent? Because that's one of the reasons why you're getting all this stuff. I know because I've done it. It's how it is. So, to Evan's point about being part of a larger movement, you place yourself in a way of saying, listen, you tell everybody else when they look at the voter list and they're going out to, campaign, this is what I'm part of. And, go from there. Campaign as you will around me. And it gives you more, not a sense of rural legitimacy, but a little bit more of a voice, more power. Because, again, the issues of how campaign laws and how campaigning is done in Massachusetts, it's just how it is.
It's funny, you mentioned, and we talked about this on a couple of occasions. We've gone back and forth on this with the Olympics. And you bring up a good point. Do you think it's more the fact that people are tripping over the fact that it looks un-American if you're not supporting, something like, say, in Boston, and Boston being such a
one of the oldest cities in the country.
Yeah, it's
it is.
It's a pretty ballsy move to say, this isn't going to be in our best interest, and we both agree it's not in our best interest.
The city's not set up for the Olympics. We don't have sprawling acres of places to build things.
And it's look, they keep calling it the Boston Olympics because that makes it more bite-sized and easy for them to sell. But the reality is, even on the proposal that they've put forward, is got venues all over Massachusetts. So this is really a Massachusetts Olympics. I'm a sports fan. I'm a Red Sox season ticket holder. I think the Olympics are kind of cool to watch. I enjoy Winter and Summer Olympics. But they are a private business, and their design is to make money off of the taxpayers. This is what they do. So fundamentally, in the business model of the Olympics is we're going to plan out all these different events. We need the taxpayers of wherever it is that they're being held to guarantee the cost at the very least, or spend the money to actually make the Olympics happen. So look at London 2012, which is an example that gets used frequently by the boosters of the Olympics to say, hey, good example. Well, almost 90% of the money that was spent, and it was close to $20 billion, came out of the pockets of taxpayers. When they started out, their proposal was that it was going to cost about $5 billion. Final bill, again, close to $20 billion. Taxpayers pay for these things. This is the design of the Olympic Games. Now, when it's sold to voters, it is typically sold in the way that it's being sold right now. Isn't this great? Isn't this going to be amazing? And of course, if you're going to spend $20 billion on something, some good things will come out of it.
Better be amazing.
But the economic research shows that the net benefit is generally pretty marginal or worse, and that the diversion of resources, and again, this is what it comes down to, is what is our vision of the future? Do we want to spend the next 10 years in Massachusetts planning for and executing on 3 weeks worth of athletic competitions? Or do we want to deal with the issues of what do we do with our schools? How do we make sure that every kid has a high quality education? How do we make sure college students don't end up in huge amounts of debt? How do we make sure that seniors are properly being taken care of? These issues end up becoming secondary. And this is what we're seeing in our public debate. So much attention and people and resources being focused on the Olympics, even at this early date, ought to tell you what you need to know about what's going to happen as we go further on down the road. So what we've decided to do with the United Independent Party is, again, not just to point out how bad this is and not just to say this is something voters need to know, but to head up an effort to get a statewide binding referendum that says that no taxpayer money can be used in support of the Olympic Games. And we're in the process of putting that together. We can start to collect signatures later on this year. And we look forward to having an opportunity for taxpayers to vote on this issue in 2016.
Well, the bottom line is when you think about this and you think about, well, what's the carryover going to be for this? What's the monetary impulse for us to have the Olympics in Boston? There really isn't one. There certainly isn't one for Central Massachusetts or Western Massachusetts.
I'd like to be in Pittsfield.
Yeah, it's like there's no upside to us having these Olympics, and I personally I would love to go see the Olympics in Boston, but at what cost?
Right.
The MBTA, we were just talking about this prior to the show. We're talking $140 billion just to revamp the MBTA.
Yeah, they need billions of dollars in order to fix the MBTA. The mayor of Boston was out yesterday saying that he felt as if the Olympics would provide that catalyst. Now, what's amazing to me, and this is what my problem is with our political establishment today, is that the image of tens of thousands of commuters stranded, unable to get to work, the knowledge that so many people struggling to get by couldn't get to their jobs each day because of the problems with the MBTA wasn't enough to get our leaders to take action, according to the mayor of Boston. Well, I actually think that the people of Massachusetts are capable of a heck of a lot more than that, and that what we need are leaders who are willing to say, this is important because it's important, not because some people from the International Olympic Committee are going to come here for a party in 10 years. Oh, we better clean up because they're coming. This is not what America is supposed to be about. It's certainly not what Massachusetts is supposed to be all about. So to me, again, the reason to have a referendum is that voters need to have their voice heard. That if our political leaders decide that they think that in their best interest, in their best judgment, that our next 10 years should be spent planning for the Olympics, well, the voters ought to have a say in that. They don't today. And I point out, when you ask about what is the difference between us and these other parties, both Democrats and Republicans are as strongly supportive of this as each other. And it's understandable as to why. If you go to the Boston 2024 website, you see the people that are behind this. It's a who's who of the politically connected on both the Democratic and Republican sides. When you see the relationships that are in place right there, that is the fundamental reason. The Boston Globe described the people behind the Olympic bid as a power elite. That was the words that they used, which to me sounds like an aristocracy, which to me sounds like something we don't need in Massachusetts. We have enough problems. So let's be voters. Let's stand up and be counted. That's why we're proceeding in this way.
You have 10 years of planning for 3 weeks worth of partying, and then you're left with what?
Yep. Debt. Debt.
It's brand new infrastructure.
No,
Remember
it's
that
not.
part.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is, once again, it goes from, it's like with the Big Dig. Well, the Big Dig, I'm in Boston all the time. I'm not seeing any real big pluses to the Big Dig in the first place. And the second place, once again, this benefits Boston. And that's great, but what about the roads? What about 290? What about Route 20? What about Spencer?
Right.
We've got $16 million of road work that needs to be done just in our town. I mean, what about the rest of the
Well, you're talking outside 128. We don't exist.
Oh, I keep forgetting about that. I
Yeah,
got to put that on the top.
And
of
you know
my
something?
list.
The people are elected officials. They do act that way. I know that when I was a candidate for governor, I had people say to me, "You shouldn't spend so much time in Western Massachusetts because there's not enough people out there." And the cynicism of that is really breathtaking. But here's the thing, and I look upon all of us as voters. If we allow for our elected officials to treat us in that way, they will. They will.
Right.
They're going to do what they can. So if a group comes in and says we're going to use taxpayer money to make a lot of money, and we're going to, in the process, support you as a candidate for office, you will do what they want you to do if all you care about is keeping your job as an elected official. We as voters have to stand up and be counted. So again, the reason to join a new party is that there needs to be an organized structure to get different people elected who would listen to someone come in and say, hey, can we get the taxpayers to pay for this big party in 10 years? And should look at them and say, you should be ashamed of yourself coming in here. Or even, good for you for coming in here, but this isn't what we do here.
No, absolutely not.
We do the people's business.
That's right.
And those are the kinds of people that the United Independent Party looks forward to supporting.
Now, if you get the referendum, say this actually happens, what happens from the point that you acquire enough signatures to go? Where does the process go from there?
So you have to get approval from the Attorney General for the language. In Massachusetts, the way the referendum process works is you actually have to draft it like it's a law. You have to get 65,000 signatures, which you can start to do after September 1st, thereabouts. You've got until mid-November to collect those 65,000 certified signatures, which means you probably need something like 80 or 100,000 raw signatures. Once you get that number, then the text of your question gets placed in front of the legislature. And the legislature could adopt it as a law. So in our case, if the provision says something like no taxpayer money to be used on the Olympics, the legislature could decide to enact it. If it does not, then you can go out and get another 10,000 signatures in the spring of 2016, and if you do that, then that appears on the ballot in November of 2016. So it's a lengthy process, and it is not set up to make it easy for people to do this. Of course, we've seen over the last number of years that plenty of questions have made it onto the ballot on pretty important issues. This will be one of them that we'll be seeing in 2016.
What's the chance that you think realistically that this would pass if you got the required amount of signatures that the House would say?
If you see the polling that's been done, the statewide polling on the Olympics, I think it would pass. I actually think that the support for the Olympics has been declining ever since the day it was announced, which, for people who have read the bid documents, you get a pretty clear picture that this thing is only going to become less popular once people see the scope of what's been proposed and the extent to which taxpayers are going to be on the hook for it. If they're able to do what they said they're going to do, which is to have a purely privately funded games, well, there's something.
It never happened.
But it'll never happen.
No.
In fact, I think that the business model just does not provide for that.
It'll never happen.
So, but I think that it would pass. I think taxpayers want to see that our money as taxpayers is spent to deal with the fundamental possibilities of what we can do in Massachusetts over the next decade, not on this Olympic event in 10 years.
I mean, we're talking 10 years. I mean, that means 10 years that we're going to focus all of our energy as a political body, as voters and everything else. We're going to be focused on just getting this
We
done.
can't fund
While
our
the rest of this,
we can't fund our schools.
right? But that's my
I'm
point.
all-
I'm trying
I'm all
to make.
set.
That's the point I'm trying to make. Is while around everything else withers and dies on the vine because we're focusing on
I
Boston.
don't want
That's
to
correct.
We want
I'm
Boston to
good.
get done. It's
I'm
like,
good.
much as I'd like to see Olympics in Boston, I think I can.
a
live
couple of
with seeing
billion bucks
someplace
into our
else.
education system. And then maybe we can use that to create some really smart kids to bounce these guys out.
You look at the current budget situation where there's $1.5 billion deficit. The funding going to for example, to state schools, which has been increased by a very small percentage. Students are having a really hard time paying for college, for example. And the debt that young people are getting into is really holding back their ability to get ahead in the world. So if we were deciding how we want to spend taxpayer money, are we better off spending it on relieving some of that student debt, making it cheaper for kids to get the degree that they're going to need to get ahead in the economy? Or should we be spending it on taxpayer backing for stadiums and archery courses?
Things that
and all
will
these
never get
things?
used again.
They will never get used. This is the history of these games.
Yes.
And it is kind of remarkable. I mean, when I talk to a lot of voters about this, they sometimes say, really, this is really the conversation that's happening? And you say, it is happening. Of course it's happening. But it's happening because, again, the rates of voter participation are so low. The majority of our legislators ran unopposed this last election cycle. That's become the norm. Well, that has to change. That's why the United Independent Party is here. I think every representative in our legislature should be asked, do you support a referendum on the Olympics? If no, why not? Why do you think taxpayers shouldn't have a right to vote on this issue? And we should know the answer to that question. We will come 2016, but we are only if we keep doing this work, only if we keep making sure that our elected officials are held accountable.
Well, that's the problem. We never have that conversation. When there's a political debate or a political discussion, if you will, there's never that discussion of, well, let's talk about the meat and potatoes part of what's going on. Because nobody wants to talk about really uncomfortable things. That's why in debates, it's like, why don't you just ask, well, if you were a tree, what tree would you be?
Well, they got pretty close to that in the governor's race. I mean, we found out about what actor everybody that Charlie thought Martha should play. That was in one of the debates that I was excluded from.
That was amazing.
You know, and it's a, you know, given the things that are going on, you would think that the issues that might have been asked would have been, do you support an Olympics in Massachusetts? Why not? Wasn't asked in any of the debates. This was going on in the background. People knew about it. I was asked about it a couple times by a couple papers, but it wasn't a major issue. For most voters, the first they heard about the Olympics was when they saw Marty Walsh and Charlie Baker standing in front of that strange Boston 2024 logo. And they said, what is this thing? Oh, this thing? This is the thing that we promised to the USOC that we would back. It's remarkable. You might think they would ask, what are you going to do if there's a structural deficit? What are we going to do about the decades of underinvestment in our mass transit system that might, I don't know, maybe there'll be a bad storm at some point and might
What,
cause
nobody
the
can
system
get to work?
Yeah, maybe no one can get to work.
Who knew?
And
Hey, boss, I'm sorry, but the train's not running.
MBTA is
I
down.
can't make it into work.
And for a couple months is what it'll end up being by the end of this. So we have a profound failure of leadership at the level of state government. It can be fixed. There are a lot of really smart people in Massachusetts. Everyone likes to say it, and it's true. The trouble is they don't go into politics. They don't end up in these positions, perhaps. But this is the nature of the problem. This is exactly, I think you've touched on it, right? Is that why would anybody? Why would anybody? Well, here's the thing. If you can create this new party, which is what we've done, now you create a framework where people who want to come in, and we're willing to talk about whatever the issue might be. I mean, James knows you've seen us over the course of both the campaign and our organizing meetings. You mentioned Pittsfield. You know, we've had organizing meetings all across the Commonwealth, including in Pittsfield. We had one right before all the storms came. People out there are hungry for real representative government that treats them as equals, not the people that you go and you collect votes from every 2 years.
That's all it is out there.
You know, but I hear those same stories from people inside 128. Here in Boston, we've had organizing meetings there. In Worcester, for sure, we've got an office right in downtown Worcester, and it's an important spot for us. I was just speaking out there on Sunday. You know, it's a real challenge. It's not going to be easy, but it has to be done. It has to be done.
Now, just for the folks at home, what safeguards would be involved if this referendum passes, if this becomes a law? What would be enacted as safeguards to protect taxpayers'
There
money?
would be a law that says you cannot use taxpayer money for the Olympics. So to the extent they follow the law, that's a pretty clear safeguard. There was a move over the last week. There was an announcement that the Speaker and the Governor and the Senate President were looking at hiring a consultant for maybe $100,000 or more to look at the costs of the Olympics and to make sure that they had a big sense of how much taxpayers might be at risk.
You gotta love this kind of stuff.
This is real. I know, it's amazing.
It's like,
I read it. I really almost laughed. I said, is this the Onion or was this the actual news? And you know, I've got an easy way to protect the taxpayers. Make it illegal for the taxpayers to be on the hook. Problem solved. Doesn't cost.
you want to come to Boston, take out some loans, pay for it yourself.
Right.
We'd be more than happy to give you the land.
Yeah.
One of the examples that the Olympics boosters like to use is Los Angeles, the 1984 Olympics, where it was financially beneficial to the backers of the Olympics. But what happened in that case was that the taxpayers said, you're not going to use any of our money, and the International Olympic Committee is going to deal with any cost overruns. Well, the IOC's never done that again, and they aren't interested in doing it now. And generally, when you look at the history of these Olympic Games, they haven't needed to. Everyone's tripping over themselves to try to spend as much money as possible. But it's a bad deal. I think the substance of it is pretty clear. The process is really bad. But again, it will change when taxpayers are able to have their voice heard. It is, to me, of a piece of so many of the other issues we face when we talk about things like schools, like transportation, like higher education, like healthcare costs. If we had leaders that were willing to take on these challenges and be just a little bit brave, then we could actually make real progress.
Well, the problem is if you're brave, then nobody votes for you.
We'll talk. You know,
It's like a dog chasing
Well,
its tail.
I think that's changing. I think we showed a lot
You know?
in the course of this last election of what's possible if you stick your neck out.
You know, on this issue of bravery, the person they have running Boston 2024 now is the former Secretary of Department of Transportation, Mr. Davey. Richard Davey is the same person who advocated pretty strongly for the Patrick administration's policy of indexing the gas tax to inflation. This person's the same person. You know, you talk about elites, power structures, the whole nine yards. Here you have a person who advocated for a very unpopular policy, which was rejected by ballot referendum at the poll, who's now running Boston 2024. No coincidence. You know, it's just a continuous circle. And again, people who are of independent mind, independent thought, let's
You probably got Deval on speed dial. Hey, I need a job. You hiring?
Well, probably that too, but
We took care of the managers. Now it's just, this is just next. This is next in line.
Hey,
You know?
there's 50 managers. You guys go ahead into the union. I'm good with that.
You mentioned, Evan, you mentioned that the Olympics is a shift in our priorities from what really matters while Olympic private investors wave the flag. What should our priorities be, and how do the Olympics get in the way of achieving these goals?
Well, we've got a really fundamental issue in Massachusetts, which is how high the cost of living is right now. And it's really driven by our healthcare costs. It's driven by lack of housing affordability for people. I'm not talking about for low-income housing. I'm talking about just housing construction. And this is really driven by the fact that the state does not provide aid to cities and towns in the way that it should. It's a simple connection between the extent to which local zoning and planning rules are driven by the need to make sure that the city can afford, or the town can afford, for people to live there. So local aid is really the centerpiece of what needs to be changed if we're going to have an economy that's accessible to people. So money that is being spent to support projects related to the Olympics is money that cannot be spent on projects supporting cities and towns. The cities and towns being supported means we're talking about our schools. I've got 3 kids in the public schools. I live in a community that, we like our public schools in my town. I live in Newton. And
you do.
We do. And we tax ourselves for that purpose. But, the amount of funding from the state is not sufficient for even towns like Newton. And if you think about how it is in communities that don't have the tax base in order to do that, it means that those kids are starting out in a more difficult position than kids that are in different kinds of communities. So it's an inherent level of fairness that's not being dealt with, but more importantly, it's a missed opportunity. Kids that are not graduating with the best possible education from the public schools are not going to be able to be as successful as they could be if they were having that kind of schooling. We like to talk about how our schools in Massachusetts are the envy of the country, and they might be, but they're falling behind. And the excess of standardized tests, the efforts to tie so much of the funding to this kind of corporate educational system is where we get into trouble.
Well, that's a road I'd like to go down.
Yeah.
I think you just touched on a raw nerve with Mr. Fournier. That's been a major bone of contention. All right, so let's go there. Where do you stand on education?
But I want to know your feelings on standardized testing.
There's too much of it.
And Common Core.
Yeah, the Common Core is the next version of the standardized testing, and there's too much of it. The trouble becomes when you see teachers. Like, I'm thinking about there's a woman who's a 3rd grade teacher in the elementary school where my kids have all gone. I have one there now. The other 2 have moved to the middle school and the high school. She does not want to teach 3rd grade anymore. She became a librarian because of the standardized testing. She's unable to spend the time with the kids that she wants to spend teaching, because of the fact that the tests are now in between her and her students. My daughter, who's now a 9th grader in the high school in Newton, in the north part of town, has commented to me on a couple different occasions, I know the only reason I'm learning this is because of the tests. Now, I don't think it's good to have 14-year-old cynics being produced in our schools. I think kids should be having their minds opened to be thinking creatively, to be thinking critically, so they can be prepared, because those are the skills, when I was a business person, that you wanted to see in your workers. So the ability to be good at taking a test is nice, and it's useful, and there's got to be some minimum standards, but the balance has gotten shifted completely out of whack, Now, again, this has happened at a time when funding sources are really limited, and so there's more money if you are following the standardized test route for the schools. And so I understand on some level why it is that happens, but I think it's deeply misguided. And I think parents know it from the experience of seeing.
So how can so let's talk about it. You have Race to the Top money, right? And you have Common Core, 2 completely different things.
Yeah.
Race to the Top was federal government.
Yep.
Common Core is privatized.
Right.
But the feds come out and say, listen, if you don't have to switch to Common Core, but if you don't, you might not get as much money, or you might not get any.
That's right.
It's blackmail.
And that's why I'm saying that I understand why the schools go ahead and do it, because the money is so tied
That's
to
right.
this. And there's money to be made off of this stuff. I mean, this is part of the problem.
Well, and then you get back into sticking your neck out, and if the Secretary of Education in the state said, you know what, I've had enough of your crap. We're not going to do that. We have a pretty good state here, and we're going to take care of things ourselves. Don't threaten our school districts with taking money away when you have a private company here creating Common Core that has nothing to do with the federal government. And I think a lot of people have at least I know in this town, in this school district, a lot of people have no idea that Common Core and Race to the Top are 2 different things.
Right.
Private, hello, Mr. Gates, Bill Gates, and federally mandated, federally funded Race to the Top. But that's just
Well, no, but you're raising this really important point because, again, in a world in which we've had decades now, and this is a problem that not just Massachusetts, this is around the country, where taxpayers are not being asked, you got to pay for the government you say you want. Bottom line, we got to pay for the government we say we want. I know that government is wasteful and inefficient. I think we're seeing how wasteful and inefficient it is. I think it's very interesting that Governor Baker comes in. Immediately there's a $765 million budget gap that within 30 days they figure out a way to close it. Kind of remarkable.
Sounds like our school.
There was apparently $765 million just lying on the table that they just didn't get rid of until they had to.
You overpay into your electric account. That's what it does.
And
then they give you a refund.
So there's money there to be reallocated, but to the extent the solution to this problem is more money, we need to, as leaders, be able to say the money's got to come from someplace, and it's either going to come from reallocating away from things we don't like, or, fact is, more taxes. We have to deal with that reality. It's a math equation. So kids end up in a situation where they're fixated on or forced to learn in the way that you're describing, Common Core, standardized testing to the expense of the real thinking that needs to happen in school, and it's because that's where the money goes. Well, if we could find a way to have more money go towards more open processes of teaching and learning that are geared to the student, that are geared to the skills of the teacher, that are geared to a modern economy, it may cost more money, but the result will be better in the end.
Absolutely.
And that should be our outcome, and that should be our goal.
Absolutely.
But that's going to take a major overhaul of the education system.
It's not a major overhaul. It's a major shift.
Well,
It's a
okay,
shift.
all right, it's a major shift, but the point is the feds don't want to touch us with a 10-foot pole. The state,
Part of it is because the public school system has become laughed at because it's a babysitting service. That's really what it's part of it has become a babysitting service. But until you switch that view, or until you rechannel that energy towards, hey, we're not a babysitter, we're here to teach, and let the teachers teach instead of let them take tests. Give the teachers back some power as far as even the school districts on how some of that money is spent and where it's spent. We're going to continue down that same path. I can't stand it.
well, look at remember when the DOE came in and we had that big meeting
Oh,
at Prouty? Remember that, James? And we're sitting there, and I was at Wire Village, and DOE comes in, and all these heads of the DOE come in, and it's, they're all talking about all these things, and here's what you need to do, and here's what you need to spend. And somebody brought up that bugaboo.
I said it.
Well, what about?
I said to him. I said, thank you for all that information. I said, but
Telling us what we're doing wrong.
how do we pay for it? And the guy had the nerve. The guy.
I remember this.
The guy had the nerve. They didn't. All three of them looked at each other. It was like Mo, Larry, and Curly. They just kind of looked at each other, and the best the guy could do is says, well, we forgot our checkbook today. Something.
Do you remember what the lady said? She looks at Paul and she goes,
That's a great
we
question.
get asked that a lot. Well, geez, you're from the Department of Education. Correct me if I'm wrong. We would think that maybe you'd be educated enough to have an answer to that question.
Didn't have an answer.
Well, we're just, you're just going to have to find a way. That's your job. Your job is to help us find that way. It's like they put this in front of your lap and they say, here you go.
Besides
You
not
figure it
coming
out.
up with anything that we already knew as a town and as a school district, what really set you off, Paul, was when that guy brought up Finland. That was
you
what
went-
really,
yeah, that was a
what
big
really
blog
set
post
you
for
off.
weeks.
Basically, what it was this guy said,
That was
well,
hot.
about technology, because the issue of technology in schools came up, and this guy said to Paul something that I remember to the effect of, well, in Finland they really don't have all this technology, and they're like #1 in the world. And I thought your head was going to explode. I was like, wait for it.
Sitting behind him, his head did explode.
But I mean,
Let
this
me tell
is
you.
the attitude.
Right.
This is the exact attitude that we get, and it's like, well, thank you for this presentation, but what's real substantive that we can leave with? And there's nothing.
Yep.
Yeah.
See, now
Absolutely
these,
nothing.
to me, these are the big issues. These are the hard issues that our leaders at the state level should be grappling with and not coming almost like visiting aristocrats to tell you, yes, you people out here in the hinterlands, you should do better at educating your children.
Thank you.
And let us show you how. And you will find a way to pay for this, right? And then we will come back.
There's
we
magic
will ride
behind-
back on our carriages and we will return
Absolutely.
to this wonderful area and see
You
what
and I
goes
might
on.
become friends. I like the way you talk.
This is what we need. It's just being real.
You're lucky. I might have you over for a beer
Thank
or
you.
two.
Oh, that'd be nice.
Evan, on education,
That was
and I'm
nice.
quoting you exactly, it says here, first we must immediately revise the Chapter 70 funding formula
Right.
to reflect current realities, including rising health care costs, greater special education needs, which are huge, and increased use of technology. The failure to address the Chapter 70 problem stands in the way of the state's effective ability to effectively deal with the growing demands for charter schools. Where do you stand on charter schools?
I'm not against the notion of charter schools in any way. fundamentally the problem becomes, where's the money going? And this is the issue, because people that are opponents of charter schools will say that when a student leaves the regular public schools to go to a charter school, that's a net loss to the public school system, and there's truth in that. So this happens, though, because there is not enough money being spent for our schools. The Chapter 70 formula being as it is, now, that was created in 1993.
It's archaic.
It was designed to help smooth out the disparities between different communities. The law said it was supposed to be updated every 2 years. Well, the last time they did it was 10 years ago. Last time before that was 10 years before that. So we've got a state that's not even following our own laws.
Maybe exponentially.
Right, so now they're in the midst of that process again right now, but the cost of educating children has only gone up. And of course, you have to account for the healthcare costs and just the increasing cost of just hiring people to do things. But at the end of the day, the cost of educating kids has gone up because of things like technology, because of the increasing ability to diagnose kids with all kinds of different learning disabilities and other problems, and the requirement we've got to take care of those kids. Well, the number of parents that I've spoken to over the last few years who have kids that have been diagnosed with dyslexia, for example, where the school systems give them a bit of a runaround in an effort to try to prevent them from gaining access to those services. These are kids that are being...
Because that costs money.
Costs money. And these are kids whose lives are being affected by this because of the fact that the money's not there.
How many shows have we done on that?
Oh God, a bunch.
But we've done at least a half a dozen. We had a mother sit with us for an hour and go over everything that she had done.
Yep.
For how many, a year and a half? It was
a
ridiculous.
long.
And then all of a sudden, bring, her phone rings, and next thing you know, kid gets everything.
You see that? But this is what moms deal with that are dealing with this stuff. I've been very impressed with the people I've met. They're very professional. You almost go into those meetings thinking, this is going to sound a little bit strange. You know, there's going to be something weird about this. Then you sit down with them, and they usually have everything very well organized and very thoughtfully presented. They say, this is what I dealt with. And you look at them and you say, did this really happen like this? And it's hard to believe, but it is what goes on in our state.
This mother she was...
Documentation... Redux.
Piles.
It was incredible.
Piles. Mm-hmm. And
Very organized.
What she went through to get the proper services for her son was phenomenal.
Now, these things are really important. And to me, these are the big issues. So the question ought to be, what do we want our educational system to look like? We already know the principles of everyone should have an appropriate education, a good education, equality in education. Well, we're not living up to that in our state. It's unfortunate, but it's true. We can do so much better. It is going to take money. It is going to take vision. It's going to take the ability to have people that want to tackle these really tough challenges at the level of the state.
You've got, when you talk about that, you've got some big problems because you can get into the education part, but then you're going to get into the financing part as well.
Yep.
And then on top of the financing part, you got to get into the pension part. Mm-hmm. You got to get into the unfunded pension part.
Right.
Well,
that's a bee's nest that nobody wants to throw a stick into.
They do not. And they have to.
Oh, that's the third rail of school politics.
Well,
don't talk about the pension.
Here's how I view those issues. People that have worked under conditions where there was a pension due to them and they made a deal on that basis, the state or the city that made that deal should live up to its obligations. That's what you said.
But moving forward,
you have to figure out ways to deal with these things. And you know what? It's not easy. But people have done these things around the country where people have been brave enough to take on these issues and say, let's figure out a way to resolve it. It is always easier for the person in the political sphere to tell people what they want to hear versus the things that just have to be dealt with. And we need those kinds of grown-ups in our system today. So look, as a candidate for governor, you get the opportunity to speak in front of many, many different groups. And I've got a lot of respect for the groups that go out and do the effort of saying, I want to hear what candidates have to say. It's an opportunity for them to try to hold those candidates accountable for their issues. But I know when I met with union groups, and I respect everybody's right to belong to a union, I would tell them this, is that there is a problem, which is that, yes, people should be living up to the obligations that they've made to your membership. At the same time, we've got a math issue. And the question that is facing all of us is the taxpayers will at some point say either we're better off going bankrupt, which has happened in some cities around and maybe even states one day around the country, or we're going to have to raise taxes massively in order to do this, and no one's going to want to do that. So let's figure out a way to solve this problem before it turns into something that's a real crisis. Unfortunately, as we've seen for far too often and too long in our state and in our country, we kick the can down the road. So terrible storms happen, the NBTA collapses. There was a report today saying that there was a 24% decrease in sales for small businesses across Massachusetts because of the collapse of the NBTA and the storms. This is a terrible crisis. And the responsibility of leaders is to take on these hard issues and say we have to deal with them. So yes, you're right, the funding is critical to making sure our education system works. And it should be the kind of thing that leaders stand up and say, we got to deal with the funding. Some of these choices can be made that aren't as difficult as others. To me, the hundreds of millions in tax breaks that go out each year to large companies, public companies that could go get money from the market, they shouldn't be coming to the state to ask for money. They should be able to do it. That money is much better spent on our kids, bottom line. Reallocating money inside of our state's budget away from things that don't make sense and towards things like this that do. Dealing with the monopolistic practices of hospitals that is what's driving our healthcare costs. We can do these things. It just requires some leaders willing to do it.
Healthcare is absolutely through the roof. And I know from this past year, I had surgery and I paid for that surgery. I had signed up because, you know, you're now when you go to a hospital, you're required to sit down with the financial folks and they go ahead and, okay, we're going to put you here. I told you I would have done
it for you for half the cost.
Yeah, you were way too eager. That was the problem. There was alcohol involved. And I go into the hospital and they sit down in front of them and they said, okay. And they signed me up and I signed up for the Healthcare Connect. It was a 2-hour process. And this is somebody who knows what they're doing at UMass. Long story short, they put me on Obamacare, and this is the kicker. I'm a private business owner, but they didn't know where to put me. So I went on Obamacare for 6 months. Now, in the meantime, I go to UMass, which is American for we're going to fleece you every way we can. And UMass generates a bill for me, after I paid for it, generates a bill to do Obamacare. And I'm like, I've already paid for the surgery out of pocket because I didn't want this to happen. So I paid for it out of pocket. They billed me and they billed Obamacare.
Sure.
It's like, and this is something UMass got bagged. What was it? 3 or 4 years ago, they got bagged for doing platelets. They had a thing going on at the mall where they had these really young models dressed up in these purple wigs, and they were signing people up at Christmas time. It was for platelet. It was a platelet donation.
Okay.
And they were charging. UMass was charging. It was a simple. I think it was $100 process to actually do the testing. UMass was charging insurance companies up to $2,000, and they charged my daughter for this. So when you got that kind of corruption going on, and it's rampant in the system, and UMass is one of the biggest. In fact, they just got a huge federal grant for the whole Ebola thing.
Right.
It's like, this is untenable. This is no wonder we can't afford this.
It's unsustainable. And businesses, as a business person myself, the highest cost we had in Massachusetts was the health insurance cost for our employees. And that meant that at a certain point, it was cheaper for us to hire people outside of Massachusetts. We hired a lot of people in Florida. And it wasn't because the workers in Florida were that much better or even equal as good as the ones we could get here in Massachusetts. But as a business, at a certain point, if it costs $20,000 to hire someone in Florida and $50,000 for the same job in Boston, you've got to make a choice. This is what drives businesses away. When we talk about small business, and every political person says small business is the backbone of the economy. We have to do everything we can to support small business. Okay, well, how? What's your plan for helping small business? You don't usually hear very much other than the nice words. At the end of the day, what affects these small businesses is the cost of doing business in Massachusetts. It's the cost.
It's prohibitive.
It's prohibitive. So if you've got to provide health insurance for people or pay for a significant portion of it, and it's so expensive because of the monopolistic practices of our hospitals and the frankly corrupt practices that you've described are commonplace, that is coming out of the pockets of every taxpayer. It's money that's now going to the pockets of the people that run those hospital systems. They're getting very wealthy, but it's off of the working people of Massachusetts. That, again, that can change. There are states like Maryland that are trying to tackle it with global payments that just gets rid of this whole idea of fee-for-service medicine. So there's no incentive for hospitals to do this. There's much more incentive for them to say, let's help people stay healthy and stay well. Obviously, it's a huge part of the cost that every city and town deals with in Massachusetts, certainly state government. We have to be able to tackle this stuff.
I got Josh talking in my ear. He's got a really sexy voice, so it always throws me off. I guess the thing I don't understand with healthcare cost is, you would think that a captive society where we are required now to carry healthcare, that because the demand is so high now that cost would start going down. But yet in Massachusetts, even when it started under Romney Care, we saw the cost of insurance just constantly climbing and climbing and climbing.
Right. Well, this is a really important point that you're touching on, because there's really two ideas here. One of them is health insurance coverage, and the other one is actual health care, which are two different things. So one is how you pay for it, and one is the actual delivery of care itself. The reason the care is getting more expensive is because hospitals keep raising their prices. It's just market behavior. When they buy up hospitals, Partners in the Boston area has been buying up hospitals. They recently got slapped and blocked.
I was going to say they recently got shot down on
They did. It was a really fascinating thing to see, because it was really apparent how much this was just antitrust, anti-competitive behavior.
Well, this just happened again at St. V's. They just got bought back out by the company that had them before. So it went from Tenant to Reliant back to Tenant.
Yep.
These systems exist to have larger market power and raise their prices. This is what this is all about. This is monopolistic behavior. This is like the cable companies, no offense. This is the way
Hey,
these
that's
things,
illegal.
I don't own one.
This is
No
the
offense
way-
taken.
Okay, good. This is the way these things work. So that's why health care keeps getting more expensive. The insurance rates go up because the cost of the care keeps going up. So when we get everybody covered, and everybody should be covered, we need to have coverage for everybody one way or the other. But that becomes very expensive as long as the hospitals are allowed to keep getting away with what they're doing. What is fascinating politically is that this is a little bit complicated, what I just described to you. And it's much easier to say, oh, you know what the problem is? It's Obamacare. You know what the problem is? It's the insurance companies. And okay, those things are part of the issue, but the piece that always gets left out is, what about the hospitals? And that's where the real money is being taken from us. So we need leaders, once again, that are willing to call it what it is. I was very gratified to see that the judge told partners that they were not accepting the deal that the Attorney General, that Martha Coakley, had made with partners to allow them to buy South Shore Hospital and those hospitals north of Boston. And I was glad to see the Attorney General, Maura Healey, say that she would sue partners if they went ahead with it. Now, what did partners do after they said, okay, we're not going to do it? They said, we're going to try to buy some hospitals out of state. This is the nature of these hospital systems. They got to gobble up smaller hospitals. They got to increase their prices. They got to drive their profits. This is what they do for a living. We have to change the economic model.
Do you think that's ever going to happen?
If we elect new people. It will not happen with our political establishment. Democrats and Republicans are complicit in this, much like they are in all these other issues I've described. So having United Independent Party candidates on the ballot in 2016 who are understanding of this issue and are willing to talk about it, that's how we'll start to make the change. This is going to take time. This is going to take effort. And again, we're not offering easy solutions. This is a struggle. The reason that we engage people and encourage them to help and help build this party, and they can go to UnitedIndependent.org. They can change their voter registration to United Independent. Every time a voter does this is what's so interesting about it. You know, we got 351 cities and towns. Everyone's got a clerk. Every time they get one of those forms and it says United Independent Party on it, it's a statement that's being made. It's not just, hey, I'm joining this new party. That clerk now sees, and every member of the Secretary of State's office who keeps track of this data, and then the voters one day too will see how many people are joining up to become a part of this new movement.
What's your the Tea Party obviously has made a lot of noise in Massachusetts for a few years now. What's your feeling towards them as being anything viable?
Well, you know, they're interesting. They were really a grassroots movement that emerged. It's an interesting story of how grassroots things can happen. I actually had the privilege late last year of debating Mark Fisher at the Worcester Tea Party event. They had one right in downtown Worcester. It was actually a very rollicking evening that was held there. They've managed to they've shown what can happen when people organize and have their voice heard. I think the challenge that the Tea Party's had is that the views they have on so many issues are not in step with most people in Massachusetts. And I respect people for holding those views. It's not a critique of the views themselves. It's the fact that they're out of step with most people in Massachusetts. So if we want to bring about the kind of change that we're talking about to make our government accountable, to be able to focus on these larger issues, we have to be able to talk about issues that cut across the ideological barriers. Because this isn't about ideology. This is about, as you've pointed out at the beginning, common sense. It's just common sense.
Yeah, that's not going to work.
It's a train wreck. On taxes, you said for nearly a century, Massachusetts has had a flat tax, which means that everyone, no matter their income, pays the same rate. Modernizing our tax code requires changing our state constitution, and to do this, the United Independent Party has called for the formation of a nonpartisan tax modernization commission that will create framework for a new tax code that is built for the 21st century. What exactly would that entail?
The Tax Modernization Commission, well, it's going to require replacing our existing tax code with one that's suited for modern economy, which means it's going to have to be a progressive tax. The people who make more should pay a little bit more, and people who make less should pay a little bit less. Our Constitution says that tax rates are flat, no matter what it is we're taxing, and that creates an inherently regressive system. It means people at the lower end pay a larger amount of their disposable income than people at the higher end. Not only is that an issue of fairness, but I don't think it makes practical sense. It doesn't make practical sense. I think everybody should pay something, no question about it. I think the expansion of things like the income tax credit that's happening now are good. But they're all efforts to try to figure out a way to back into the idea of having a more modern tax code. And the challenge we have is that this constitutional requirement of a flat tax, which is over 100 years old, is not suited to a modern economy. It doesn't allow for the flexibility to figure out ways to raise the tax money that our state government is going to need to fulfill our priorities as voters in a way that's modern. So I think the way to do it is with a commission. And it takes years to amend the Constitution to do those things, but if we can do that, we can also build the consensus needed to build something that people will be satisfied with. I mean, no one wants to or likes to pay taxes, but we have to.
Well, I know it's kind of early in that thought, but you're going to get an argument of where's that dividing line? Where do you put that line of who makes what and they should pay a little bit more, and who makes less, who doesn't make that much and they should pay a little bit less?
Look, the people who founded our country, who were very smart people, they really understood human nature. They said this was an experiment in self-government, which is a very powerful thought. Because what it means is that decision that you're talking about has to be made by the people, through their elected representatives or otherwise. There is no king or queen that's going to come here and say, here's where the dividing line is. So, look, I think it's reasonable if a person's making over $1 million a year to have them pay a little bit more taxes than someone who's making $10,000 a year. Under our current tax code, they actually pay the same tax. They're subject to the same tax rate, and as a percentage of their disposable income, the guy making 10 grand actually pays a higher percentage than the person making $1 million. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's certainly, in a world in which we're struggling to figure out where does the tax revenue come from, it isn't a sensible thing. But you know what? We have to be able to argue those things out. We should have votes on these things. There was an effort in the last legislative session to have what they called a tax fairness commission, which didn't go anywhere, although they wrote an interesting report. But we need people that want to grapple with this stuff. I mean, this is, to me, the stuff of self-government. This is the kind of thing that Americans are capable of debating and wrestling with and coming up with an answer.
It's the kind of thing we're horrible at as as a political society.
We've got some serious issues in our country. Look, this is why I got into this. I'm a business person. I had a successful career going as an entrepreneur. I don't have any need to do this. There's no money to be made in politics unless you decide to be one of these people that takes money in politics.
Lobbyists.
That happens?
You know, that does happen. I've heard stories.
That was my next question. Lobbyists.
Yeah.
Term limits.
Term limits, we ought to have term limits. Think about what happens in our government. So the Speaker of the House, Bob DeLeo, when he became Speaker, he said
that was
no
a
more than
classic
8
one.
years. No more than 8 years.
Except for me.
Until it gets close to 8 years. And then not only is he going to go back on it, but he gets roundly supported by his caucus and others saying, hey, sure, go for it. And it's a story for about a day in the newspaper, and then we go on as if nothing ever happened. Well, we can't trust our elected officials to live up to their word, nor should we. It's democracy. And if we need to have installed term limits, we ought to have term limits. And I believe it'd be something that would be a great benefit to our democracy.
So do you think, when you say term limits, let's say somebody serves 6 years. Mm-hmm. If they want to get back into the system, should they be able to, after a certain amount of time, should they be able to run again?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't have a
That's
problem
fair.
with that.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that at all.
6 years in, 6 years out.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny.
Or whatever.
When I ran for state rep, and one of the things I brought up was I asked one of the other candidates. I said, "Where do you stand on term limits?" And he said, "Well, I feel the term limits. The voters vote you every 2 years, so that's how they exercise their
Right.
term limits." I'm like, that's such a BS answer. You know, it's like
That's the answer of a guy who's in office.
well, yeah, it's well, it was wanted to be in office.
I
And
need
it's
my
like,
pension.
Yeah.
I need
You
6
know?
years. I need my pension.
yeah, I got to at least get that part of
3
it
years,
in,
whatever
you
it
know,
was.
or we can petition for it after 6 years.
It's
like,
a very strange instinct. I don't understand it. I mean, it's about power, which is what these jobs end up being about at the end of the day, unfortunately, as opposed to public service. If you're in it for public service, you can understand the notion of, even George Washington said, 2 terms and no more. That's George Washington. He's the person that they would have said it's fine.
If you can't get something done in 8 years or 6 years,
Right.
you need to go.
Or even as Speaker DeLeo was absolutely right when he first said this about the 8-year limit he
That was
wanted to put on
awesome.
himself. He said that it gets stale. We need fresh faces in the process. It keeps the process more dynamic. Well, apparently he changed his mind over the last
That's
6
because
years.
nobody read the fine print.
well, we've
except
had
for
House
me.
speakers who've also dallied with lawyers after they got
Indeed.
It's like we just can't seem to get a leader in there that's Theresa Murray was I think the first one who didn't go out in handcuffs. Mm-hmm. And that speaks huge to Boston
What's
politics.
it, the last two? Is
Yeah,
it the last
two
two?
before
Speakers,
Theresa Murray. Yeah.
So, we've got to elect new people. And again, this is what I keep coming back to, is that if the system is not delivering the kinds of people that we want to have in these kinds of positions, then we need to change the system. We can't wait for them to do it because they're not going to. So it's upon us. We all have to do it.
Well, I'm being told we got about 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Josh is phonetically telling that in my ear. Summarize for us. Give us an overview of why somebody should be involved and why if they're not already interested. What could they do, or what should they want to do to be part of this?
The question I always ask voters is, what have the 2 traditional parties done for you lately? You know, are they dealing with the issues that you think are important? The more you wait for them to come around and actually do what you want, the more they're taking you for granted. And I think we've passed the point in our country where we should sit by and hope for the best. It's time to actually take action. So what was really important that happened in November of 2014 is that enough people came out to make the United Independent Party an official party. Being unenrolled, being independent in Massachusetts is not good enough anymore. We need an organized voice. So voters should go to unitedindependent.org, print out that form, enroll in the United Independent Party, join the people that are doing it now. Later this year, there's going to be online voter registration that the state will have in place. That's going to make it a lot easier to go and enroll in a new party. But be part of what we're doing. We're building our platform. As you see when you go on that website, we're pretty direct and real about what the issues are. You know, you touched on a number of issues in the course of this interview.
It's pretty thorough. This is just, I just pulled out some of the ones that I
That's right.
you know, that I knew that we've always talked about.
And that's just the beginning. You know, any issue that we wanted to talk about, I mean, we had free range of whatever we wanted to talk about, whether it was charter schools, the education system, taxes. This is the way people should be talking in politics. It shouldn't just be us here around the coffee table or around a beer. This should be the kind of people that we want to see in office. So that's what the United Independent Party is here to deliver. And we need the help of voters to turn it into even more of a permanent fixture on the Massachusetts landscape.
It just seems like I know that I've felt very disenfranchised, and I mean I have friends that are Tea Party, and I believe the Tea Party and we've talked about this on a local level is a good idea. But the one thing I saw during the state rep race was the Tea Party was like, well, we didn't really have a Tea Party candidate, so we had a debate that we went and it was a lot of fun. It was a great debate. One of the best debates was up in Charlton at the Overlook. And when we got done, people walked up and said, you know, I'd love to vote for you, but you're an independent. Huh. And when people have to get out of that mindset of, well, I have to vote the letter, I have to vote the D or the R, or and to me that's as somebody who watches all this and is interested in this, it's very frustrating that people don't have that sense of their own self, that just because you're a member of the Republican Party doesn't mean you actually have to vote that. You can find another candidate.
Well, there's people in the parties that will tell you, and we ran into this, there's some of those dirty tricks that get played, and people saying, oh, wait, you're a registered Democrat, you're not allowed to vote for the independent candidate, or the same thing with Republicans. You say, that's not true. And look, there's a lot of civic education and engagement that needs to happen. Civics is one of those areas in the standardized tests. You don't see a lot of that. And it's been really dropped from school curriculums in some communities. This is a problem, yeah. Now, you would think if you could get all conspiratorial and say, oh, well, maybe that's by design, and I don't know. All I know is that the result is exactly what you'd expect to see, which is a populace that doesn't really understand how the process works too often, is dissatisfied with it, doesn't think that they've got the tools to make it change. So the power of what we've created with the United Independent Party is a way to go out there, educate people on what the issues are, get their input on it so we can build out our platform as to what it can be, elect new people, make the system change. So I'm pretty excited. I mean, it's fun to be doing this. It's hard work. We're up against some pretty tough and entrenched forces. But the inspiration I get is from the fact that pretty much everywhere I go, I don't run into people that say, why would anybody do this? They don't say that. They say, I'm glad someone is, and how can we help?
All right, well, we're going to have to wrap this up. I want to say thank you to Evan Falchuk for being our guest tonight. I think this was, I got more out of this than
I'd love to have you come back at some point.
Yeah,
I mean, listen,
a pleasure.
We're not in front of 1 million people, but if
You've got every person in Spencer watching.
No, I hope
there
so.
you go. All right, well, folks, thank you for joining us tonight. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and we will see you next time on The Other Side. Take care.